Welcome to the deep dive. Ever feel like disagreements can kind of spiral out of control, turning into full-blown arguments?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
We're going to do a deep dive into like the roots of those clashes, those
Yeah.
arguments, and maybe find some ways to, keep things a little more harmonious.
Sounds good. It's interesting how, arguments seem to be this, universal human experience.
Totally. And so for this deep dive, you sent us some pretty interesting material, like some biblical verses and even like a podcast script. And so I feel like you're really trying to figure out why we argue, not just, how to win an argument.
I think that's a really important distinction.
Yeah.
Because so often we focus on the tactics of argumentation, but what's really fascinating here is that both of the sources you sent, the biblical verses and this podcast script, despite coming from very different perspectives,
Yeah.
actually point towards similar root causes for those arguments.
Yeah, let's unpack that. So this podcast script that we have uses this kind of interesting metaphor. It says arguments, stem from the flesh.
Right.
That part of us that's kind of impulsive and prone to like maybe not the best choices.
The more base part of ourselves, you could say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you see that connecting to like the biblical verses?
Well, if we think about that idea of the flesh, that connects really well to what the Bible might call our carnal side.
Okay.
And that's what fuels those feelings of jealousy and pride that James 3.16 talks about.
Okay. Yeah, I see that.
James links those negative emotions, the jealousy, the strife, to disorder and essentially bad behavior.
Yeah.
It suggests that those kinds of feelings create a breeding ground for trouble.
Right. And so Proverbs 13.10 takes a much more direct approach, stating that pride is like the source of all quarrels.
It's very direct, isn't it?
Yeah.
I find it really interesting how these ancient texts, like Proverbs, can still resonate with how we understand human behavior today. It raises an important question, though. How can we actually recognize when our pride is what's making us want to argue?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like, let's say you're about to get into a disagreement with someone. How do you stop and ask yourself, is this like my pride talking?
In those moments, it might be helpful to just ask yourself, am I more focused on being right in this situation?
Oh, that's good.
Or am I more focused on understanding the other person's perspective?
Yeah.
Are you going into this with an open mind, or are you just determined to prove your point, even if it means shutting down the other person?
Right. That's a great point. And this podcast script also emphasizes that while anger is a natural human emotion, it's how we express that anger
Right.
that can become, let's say, less than ideal.
It's about how we channel that anger, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And Ephesians 4.2627 really emphasizes that. It says, be angry, but do not sin. It's like saying it's okay to feel angry, but we don't have to let it control us.
Right.
We have a choice in how we respond. And if we choose a destructive path, that can have some pretty serious consequences.
It makes me think about this section in the podcast script that basically says that, putting up with arguments and harsh words simply isn't in line with like a more spiritual life.
Yeah.
And it's not just about, how it impacts our relationships with others, but it also potentially impacts our relationship with, something bigger than ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think the script really emphasizes that getting caught up in those kinds of arguments might actually be a sign that we're giving in to our more base or carnal nature.
Right.
Instead of striving for that spiritual growth and personal development.
Yeah. And so, the interesting idea, right, that arguments could be like, coming from this like darker force, this spirit of strife, as the script calls it.
It is a pretty powerful concept.
Yeah, it makes you think twice about, like, is it even worth getting into this argument?
Exactly. It challenges us to really think about the implications of our actions, even in those seemingly small, everyday disagreements.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
I mean, it also makes you wonder, like, if we were going to entertain this idea of this, like, spirit of strife, are some people just more prone to arguing than others?
That's a fascinating question.
Yeah. And, like, is this something we can actually control? Or are we just, like, puppets to these forces?
Well, I think that's where both the script and the biblical verses really emphasize personal responsibility.
Yeah.
It's not about absolving ourselves of blame, but recognizing that even if there is a spiritual element involved, we still have the power to choose how we respond.
So it's not about blaming some external force, but it's about, like, acknowledging that we have a choice in how we react.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that inner power.
Yeah, that's good.
And the script even offers some concrete advice on how to break free from those patterns of arguing.
Okay, so like what kind of advice?
Well, it encourages us to, acknowledge our pride, choose silence instead of fueling the fire, focus on love and unity, and even seek guidance through prayer.
Wow, those are really solid steps.
Mm.
But I'm curious, like, how do we actually put those into practice in the moment? Like
Yeah.
when you feel that anger rising and that urge to fight back is just like so strong. How do you stop yourself and actually choose a different path?
That's where mindfulness becomes so crucial.
So,
The script really highlights the importance of being present, being aware in those heated moments. It's about taking that pause, that deep breath, and really thinking before we speak.
so it's like hitting the pause button on that like fight or flight response
Exactly.
and giving yourself a chance to respond more thoughtfully.
Mhm.
But what about like when the other person just keeps pushing your buttons? They're coming at you with all they've got. You're trying to stay calm, but it's not working. What do you do then?
That's when the advice from the script to choose silence over strife becomes so powerful. Sometimes the best response, the most powerful response, is to simply disengage from the argument.
So what does that look like? Like, do you just walk away?
Well, it could mean physically removing yourself from the situation if you can. It could also mean refusing to engage with their anger, not mirroring their energy, not getting sucked into their storm.
Right. So it's about recognizing that you don't have to match their intensity, that you can like stay calm even when they're not.
Exactly. And often that calm demeanor can actually disarm the other person. It breaks that cycle of escalation and opens up a space for a more productive conversation later on.
Okay, I like that. But what if like, walking away or, staying silent feels like giving in? Like
Yeah.
you're letting the other person win.
That's where it's so important to shift your perspective. The goal shouldn't be about winning the argument, but rather about preserving the relationship and striving for understanding.
So it's about choosing peace over being right.
Exactly. And that's where the concept of love and unity becomes really powerful. The script reminds us that arguments divide, while love and understanding build bridges. It's about recognizing that even in the midst of a heated exchange, there's still that connection between you and the other person.
Right. Yeah, I see that. So even when you're like disagreeing, can you still hold on to that sense of connection?
Absolutely. It might sound a little cheesy, but visualizing that connection can actually help you choose your words more carefully.
Okay.
It reminds you that even if this person is frustrating you right now, there's still someone you care about and want to have a positive relationship with. Their feelings and your bond with them matter.
That's a great visual to kind of keep in mind. And speaking of helpful reminders, the script also encourages us to pray for guidance in these situations. So how do you see prayer fitting into like navigating disagreements?
I think prayer can be an incredibly powerful tool in these situations. It allows us to tap into a source of wisdom and strength that's beyond our own limited understanding. It's about recognizing that we don't have all the answers and that sometimes we need to seek guidance from a higher power.
Right. So it's not about praying for the other person to change or for things to go our way, but it's about seeking guidance on how to approach the situation with grace and with wisdom.
Precisely. We can pray for patience, for understanding, for the ability to see things from the other person's perspective, and for the strength to choose our words and actions carefully. We can even pray for the other person, even if we're angry with them in that moment.
Yeah, it's like inviting a higher power into the conversation to kind of help us navigate those really choppy waters.
Yeah.
But, as we're talking about this, it strikes me that it's not just about sidestepping arguments for the sake of avoiding conflict. It feels like it goes much deeper than that.
I agree. It's about cultivating a way of being in the world that's rooted in love, understanding, and respect, even when we encounter differences of opinion.
It's about choosing harmony over discord, connection over division.
Beautifully put. And this actually brings us to another really interesting point that the script makes. This idea that arguments are actually a transgression against something greater than ourselves.
Right. Like a spiritual misstep almost.
Exactly. And Ephesians 4:26-27, it tells us, be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold.
Yeah.
It's like when we let that anger drive us into those arguments, we're opening the door for negativity and disharmony to take root.
Right. And it can impact,
Mm.
not just our relationships with others, but our relationship with ourselves even. And with, as you said, something bigger.
Absolutely, and I think that's really what the script is getting at. It's not just about the argument itself, but the energy and the intentions behind it. If we're coming from a place of pride, anger, or just needing to be right no matter what, it's going to create that negativity all around.
Right. So what if we approach disagreements with humility, a willingness to listen, a desire to actually understand?
Well, then, even if we don't agree in the end, we can still maintain respect and connection.
Yeah, it's about shifting the goal from winning to understanding.
Exactly. And that's a powerful shift because it takes the pressure off of needing to be right all the time.
Yeah.
It allows us to open up to other perspectives, even if they challenge our own.
It's about recognizing that we might actually learn something from the disagreement rather than simply trying to prove our point.
That's it. And that openness to learning can be incredibly enriching for us in our relationships.
So, if we can cultivate that mindset, that humility, understanding, willingness to learn, maybe, just maybe, we can transform our relationship with arguments entirely.
Imagine that. Seeing disagreements not as battles to be won, but as opportunities to grow, to connect, to deepen our understanding.
Right. Like imagine looking forward to a disagreement and thinking, what am I going to learn here?
It might sound radical, but I think it's possible. And the insights we've been discussing from both the podcast script and the biblical verses, they seem to point us in that direction.
It feels like we're being given a roadmap to navigate disagreements in a more conscious way, with more compassion, and ultimately in a way that's more fulfilling.
Absolutely. And what's really exciting is that this roadmap isn't just about avoiding arguments. It's about something much, much bigger than that.
It's about like embracing a way of life that's rooted in love, understanding, and just a profound respect for ourselves and for everyone around us.
Beautifully said. And as we dig deeper into this topic, I'm starting to see really clear connections between the spiritual and the practical aspects of dealing with disagreements. They're not separate concepts, but rather two sides of the same coin.
I totally agree. It's like those, what might seem like abstract concepts for the Bible, are actually giving us concrete tools for handling these conflicts in our daily lives.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about like these lofty ideals, but actual practical strategies for dealing with how complex human interaction can be.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
what's so fascinating about this deep dive.
Yeah.
It's not just theory, it's practical wisdom that you can actually apply to your life right now.
Right. Yeah. So as we move into the next part of this deep dive, I want you to hold on to this question. How can you take what we've learned about pride, anger, and that deeper meaning of arguments and turn those insights into concrete steps for creating more harmony in your relationships?
How do we move from conflict to connection?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It's definitely something to think about, and we'll keep exploring this in our next segment.
Picking up where we left off, I think it's worth kind of circling back to that idea from the podcast script about arguments, stemming from what it calls like a spirit of evil. It's a pretty strong statement, but it really makes you think about like what's going on beneath the surface.
Yeah.
Like maybe it's not just about disagreeing.
Yeah. No, it definitely adds like a whole other layer to the conversation.
It does, doesn't it? And what's interesting is that like if we acknowledge this like spiritual aspect to conflict, then we might need a different approach, like
Yeah.
a different set of tools for dealing with it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Like almost acknowledging that there's like these forces beyond our like conscious awareness that could be influencing how we behave.
Exactly. And the biblical verses actually like offer some guidance on how to deal with this.
Okay.
Remember that passage from Ephesians we talked about? Be angry, but do not sin. Don't let the sun go down while you're still angry, and don't give the devil a foothold.
Right.
It's like a warning to us, that if we don't control our anger, we might be opening ourselves up to something that could make things even worse.
Right. It's almost like a warning, like, hey, if you let anger control you, you might be opening yourself up to some bad stuff.
Exactly. And that's where those practical suggestions from the podcast script come in. Admitting our pride, choosing silence, focusing on love and unity.
Yeah.
Those are like strategies to counteract those darker influences.
It's like we're being given this spiritual toolkit for dismantling arguments from hell, as they say.
I love that analogy,
Yeah.
a spiritual toolkit. And one of the most important tools, in my view, is prayer.
Yeah.
Seeking guidance and strength from a source beyond ourselves, recognizing that we don't always have the answer.
Right, right. The script really emphasized turning to prayer in those moments, and I can see why. Like, It's acknowledging that you don't have to go through this alone.
Exactly. And it's not just about, asking for things to go our way.
Right.
It's about connecting with a source of wisdom and strength,
Yeah.
to help us navigate those situations with grace and clarity.
Or it's like surrendering the ego
Yes.
and letting a higher power kind of guide our thoughts and actions.
Beautifully said. And something that stood out to me from James 3.16 was the part about the link between jealousy and strife and disorder.
Oh, yeah.
It's like when those negative emotions take root, they create chaos in
Right.
our lives and in our relationships.
Yeah, and not just like internal chaos either,
Yeah.
but like it can manifest in really destructive ways in the world around us.
Absolutely. Think about all the conflicts in history that have been fueled by jealousy and strife wars, political divisions, even family feuds. It shows just how powerful those negative emotions can be.
Right, right. It's like this reminder that what seems like a personal struggle can actually have a much bigger impact.
It can.
Yeah, and it makes you realize that managing those emotions isn't just about personal peace, but like it's about contributing to a more harmonious world.
Exactly. We have a responsibility to manage these emotions, not only for ourselves, but for the well-being of others. And that's where I think mindfulness comes in. The podcast script talked about the importance of taking a pause, that moment of awareness before reacting. It can really help us to break free from those reactive cycles.
Right, right. Like that mindfulness. It's so
Yes.
critical.
It's essential because it allows us to step back from those knee-jerk reactions, the anger, the defensiveness. Instead, we can take a breath, observe our emotions, and then consciously choose a more constructive response.
Right.
It's not about suppressing our feelings, but responding to them in a way that doesn't escalate the conflict.
Right, right. It's like hitting that pause button allows us to like tap into that deeper wisdom, to connect with that, like, that higher power we were talking about.
I love how you put that.
Yeah.
And I think a key element of mindfulness is self-awareness.
Go.
The more we understand our own triggers, those buttons that people know how to push, the better equipped we are to handle those situations. We can kind of anticipate those reactions and then prepare ourselves to respond more skillfully.
So it's like doing that like inner work.
Yeah.
Like to really understand like what sets us off and why.
Exactly. It might not always be comfortable, but it's so valuable
Right.
because the more we understand ourselves, the more compassion we have, not only for ourselves, but for others too.
Right. Right. And that compassion, that's key, isn't it?
It is.
It allows us to approach those disagreements with like a more open heart.
It does.
Like a willingness to understand where they're coming from.
Absolutely. It's about remembering that the person we're arguing with is another human being
Right.
with their own thoughts and feelings and experiences. And all of those things have shaped how they see the world.
Yeah, it's recognizing that their perspective, even if you don't agree with it, it's still valid.
Exactly. And it deserves to be heard.
And that brings us back to like that essential question.
Oh,
How do we shift our focus from winning to understanding?
yes. It's a tough one, especially when our ego is involved.
Right.
But I think, these sources you brought, they give us some tools for making that shift. It's about recognizing that true growth doesn't come from proving ourselves right,
Yeah.
but from opening ourselves up to those new perspectives and maybe challenging our own assumptions along the way.
And so, like, wouldn't you say one of the most powerful tools for doing that is humility?
Absolutely. The more we cultivate humility, the less we need to be right all the time. It's about recognizing that we don't have a monopoly on the truth.
Right.
Our perspective is just one of many, and there's always something to learn from others, even those we might disagree with.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that we're all works in progress,
Mm-hmm.
that we all have blind spots. And, learning from other people is a necessary part of like growing and evolving.
I agree.
It's about recognizing that like true strength comes not from like defending your ego, but from like being brave enough to be wrong.
Yes. To admit when we've made a mistake and to be open to changing our minds. That brings us back to that interesting point the podcast script brought up about arguments being a transgression against something greater than ourselves,
Right,
the
right.
spiritual misstep.
Yeah, and like it's like when we let that pride and anger control us, we're not just creating separation between ourselves and the person we're arguing with, but also between ourselves and, like something bigger.
It's a disconnect from that sense of unity and interconnectedness that we were talking about earlier.
It disrupts that harmony.
It does, that harmony that exists when we're aligned with our true nature, with our higher selves.
Right. So it's not just about avoiding arguments to like prevent conflict. It's about trying to live in a way that reflects our values,
Yeah.
our truths, our connection to something greater.
Beautifully put. It's about creating a world where love, understanding, and respect are the guiding principles, and not just in our relationships, but in all of our interactions.
And that's a world I think we all want to live in.
I think so too. So, listener, as we continue exploring these ideas, think about this. How can you cultivate that sense of interconnectedness? How can you apply it in your own life?
Yeah. Whether it's, through spending time in nature or practicing gratitude, or
Mhm.
even just like taking a moment to really appreciate the beauty around you, connecting with that oneness can make a huge difference.
It really can. It shifts our perspective and can have a profound impact on our relationships and our overall well being. And speaking of shifting perspectives, another point that the podcast script brought up that I thought was important was about being mindful of the language we use
Oh,
when
right.
we're disagreeing with someone. Words have power,
Yeah.
and the way we use them can either make things better or worse.
Right. Yeah, and the script talked about how, like, tolerating harsh words and insults, that kind of language, can
And
actually be, like, harmful to our relationships, not just with the person we're arguing with, but also with, like, a higher power,
exactly.
our spiritual well-being even.
It creates this toxic environment, right?
Yeah.
That kind of blocks love and understanding.
Right, like, those harsh words are like putting up a wall. And so it makes it impossible for that empathy and compassion to come through.
That's a great way to put it. And, even if we're feeling angry or frustrated, we still have a choice in how we express ourselves.
Right.
We can choose to react impulsively or we can choose to respond thoughtfully. And that choice can really change the whole outcome of that interaction.
It's about making that conscious effort to communicate in a way that, like, honors yourself and the other person, even when it's hard.
Exactly. We can choose to speak from a place of love, even if we're disagreeing.
Yeah.
We can use words that are respectful, even if we're feeling hurt. It's not about suppressing our feelings, but finding a way to express them without causing more harm.
Right. It's like recognizing that words have the power to build bridges or to burn them.
Yes. And choosing to build bridges is essential if we want to have healthy, fulfilling relationships.
And one of the most powerful ways to do that is by truly listening to what the other person is saying,
Oh, absolutely.
not just waiting for your turn to talk.
Right.
It's about quieting that inner voice, the one that's like already planning your response and really opening yourself up to understand their perspective.
It's about letting go of our own agenda for a moment and trying to see the world through their eyes.
Yeah, it's like when we truly listen to someone, we're saying, I see you, I hear you, and I value your perspective, even if I don't agree with it.
Exactly. And that can make all the difference in how the conversation unfolds.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that we can disagree without disconnecting,
Yes.
that we can have different perspectives without, like, judging or dismissing each other.
Absolutely. And that validation can really help to de-escalate a conflict
Right.
and create a more harmonious dynamic. It's about remembering that we're not enemies in a battle,
Right.
but two human beings trying to understand each other.
I like that. So, listener, as we head into the final part of this deep dive, I want to challenge you to think about the language you use in your disagreements. Pay attention to your words, your tone, and the impact it has on the other person. Our words have power, and we have a responsibility to use them in a way that promotes understanding.
Think about it this way. Are you using words that build bridges or burn them? Are you communicating from a place of love or from a place of fear? Are you seeking to understand or to be understood?
Yeah.
These are really important questions to consider because the way we use our words, it has an impact that reaches far beyond the moment. It shapes our relationships, our communities, and ultimately, the world we live in.
So, as we wrap up this, like, deep dive into arguments, I think it's worth, like, going back to that big question.
Yeah.
Why do we argue in the first place? We looked
Yeah.
at the spiritual side of it, talked about pride and anger, even touched on things like mindfulness and prayer. But I'm curious, like, for you, what does it all boil down to? What's the core motivation behind our disagreements?
That's a really great question to think about as we kind of tie all these threads together. And I think if we look back at the sources you sent, both the biblical verses and that podcast script, they both kind of point to one common thread, the desire to be right.
Yeah, it's funny how that need to be right always seems to pop up when we're disagreeing with someone.
Yeah.
It's like our ego gets all caught up in it.
Yeah.
And suddenly, like, winning the argument becomes more important than, like, actually understanding each other.
It's almost like we tie our sense of self to our opinions. So when someone challenges those opinions, it feels like a personal attack. And I think that need to be right often comes from this like deeper desire to feel validated, to feel seen and heard.
Yeah, I could see that. Like, when we feel like our perspective's not being taken seriously, it's natural to want to defend it, right? To fight to be heard.
Exactly. And sometimes that fight turns into an argument. But what if, instead of trying to win, we focused on really understanding the other person's point of view? Imagine going into a disagreement with, like, a sense of curiosity, eager to learn and explore, not to, like, conquer and debate.
I like that shift. It takes the pressure off needing to be right all the time
Yeah.
and lets us, like, be more open in the conversation.
Exactly. And one thing that I think can help us do that is cultivating a sense of curiosity.
Okay.
When we're curious, we're not so worried about proving our point. We're more interested in understanding the other person's world, open to being surprised, to discovering something new.
So instead of, like, trying to force them to see things our way, we're trying to see things through their eyes.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is that when we approach disagreements with that kind of curiosity, it often leads to us understanding not just the other person, but ourselves better too. We start to question our own assumptions, see things from new angles.
Right. It's like those disagreements become mirrors, reflecting back our own biases, helping us grow in ways we might never have expected.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's like those moments of conflict, when we approach them with that curiosity and openness, they can actually help us transform and grow.
So it seems like the key to changing how we deal with arguments is shifting our focus from being right to understanding, from winning to learning.
That's it. And I think that shift starts with cultivating qualities like humility, compassion, curiosity, and that willingness to actually listen to what the other person is saying.
It's about going into disagreements with an open heart, wanting to connect, even when you don't agree on everything.
Perfectly said. And as we've been talking about all of this, I keep thinking back to that proverb from Proverbs 13.10. Pride leads to conflict. Those who take advice are wise.
It is a good reminder that pride can really get in the way when we're disagreeing with someone. It's like when we're so focused on being right, we close ourselves off to learning anything new.
And being willing to take advice, to be open to other perspectives, that's true wisdom. It means being able to step outside of our own limited view and realizing that we might not know everything.
Right. It's recognizing that we're all still learning, that we all have those blind spots, and that learning from others is part of how we grow. And that means admitting when we're wrong and being willing to change our minds. That takes real strength.
It does. And it reminds me of that idea from the podcast script about arguments being a transgression against a higher power, a spiritual misstep.
Right. It's like when pride and anger are controlling us, we're not just creating a separation between ourselves and the person we're arguing with, but also between ourselves and something bigger.
Exactly. It's like we're disconnecting from that feeling of unity and interconnectedness.
Right.
We're disrupting the natural harmony that comes when we're aligned with our true selves.
So it's not just about avoiding arguments to prevent conflict. It's about trying to live in a way that shows our highest values, our connection to something beyond just us.
It's about creating a world where those guiding principles are love, understanding, and respect.
And that sounds like a world worth striving for.
It does, doesn't it? So, listener, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something to think about. What if, instead of seeing disagreements as problems to solve, we saw them as opportunities?
Opportunities to learn, to connect, to understand each other better.
What if, instead of trying to win, we focused on learning? What if, instead of putting up walls, we built bridges? It might be challenging, but I think it's a challenge worth taking on.
Because ultimately, those moments of disagreement, those times when our views clash, those are the moments when we can discover our greatest truths and build our strongest connections.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope this is giving you some insights into the world of arguments and some tools for creating more harmony in your own life. Keep seeking understanding, keep building those bridges, and keep those conversations going.